been to a design talk. We're super excited to have them back. If anyone has any ideas, know anybody, please let myself, James, or Lauren know. Thanks, James, for kicking us off. I'm excited. I'll let you take it away.
Sure.
Yeah.
Which of these do I actually use to advance the slides? Is it the
Little one.
This
It's
one?
the little one, yeah. Should be.
Cool.
There you go.
There we go.
There you
Great.
go.
Okay. Yeah, so it's funny, I think it was Chris, you were saying, oh, hey, when is your first design talk? Oh, exciting. It's also mine. So I joined, I joined at the end of December of 2019 and never really had a chance to actually attend any of these. So it's kind of funny to be presenting as my first one. So thanks to the team that helped us get this kicked off again for letting me start everything. For those of you who don't know, one of my hobbies is actually doing iconography, which is how this all came up. I happen to have some in the background of my office while we were all working from home, and it just kind of came up in discussion. So I figured I'd start off with the first of two topics. So I'm going to call them sacred art, sacred space. In this instance, I want to speak a little bit about sort of the underlying purpose of iconography, and then move into how it actually gets used in the program of the church, and what it represents. And then when we get to the second part, which will happen at some nebulous point in the future, get a little more specific about how you actually do it, how to interpret those kinds of images, that sort of thing. And I want to go ahead and apologize in advance to anybody who's ever taken an architectural history course, because you're probably going to see a lot of the things that you talked about in that class, but I'm going to go a little bit more in depth into talking about exactly how all of those elements relate to each other, rather than about them as individual objects, divorced from their context. So to start, I think we need to sort of understand what is an icon. I think maybe if you hear that word, what's something that might come to your mind?
Britney Spears.
Also an icon.
Starting off strong.
Maybe like a symbol. I know,
Yeah, like religious art, right?
Yeah.
Religious art?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or like when we were in school, I know like we were all talking about like app design and what is the icon for your app or whatever. But I mean, if we're talking about what that word actually means, it's a Greek word. The root icona means an image. It's just very simple, right? Like a painting or a sculpture. I think that it's actually a different word from what they would use to talk about like an idol in the temple or what have you. But like think like the frescoes in Pompeii or mosaics, all of that stuff is sort of falls under the umbrella of icona. But when we talk about it in from a Christian perspective, what we're typically speaking about is an image that represents the Lord or his saints or an event that by its presence and by being looked at and engaged with invites you to veneration, which is sort of a show of respect toward that thing, to contemplation, which is sort of bringing into yourself what it means and what it does, and then ultimately participation in that event. And I think, typically when you look at Byzantine iconography, what you're seeing is panel icons, which are individual things that we'll talk about in a second. But that understanding also extends to the sacred space, right? So like the way that those images are used in a church draws you into the experience, not only of what's happening in that space, but sort of the broader meaning of it. And I think, especially for Byzantine iconography, the sort of central ethos can be summed up in this quote here that I wanted to share. There's a man named Athanasius. He was a bishop in Alexandria. I think at the time he wrote this, he may have been a deacon. Whatever, who cares? Only me, right? So the short of it is basically it's God became man so that we, human beings, might become God. That's sort of the ethos that underlines why icons can even exist in the first place and how they function for the human person. The idea being what we say in Christian theology, we say the incarnation, that God becomes a person in Jesus Christ, invites us into participation in him. So that underlying idea undergirds everything from the architecture of the church to the frescoes, to the written scriptures, to the liturgy, all of that stuff. We're going to, contain ourselves just to the art on the walls. Byzantine iconography typically takes three forms. It takes the form of a panel icon, like you see there on the left. That's a 6th century encaustic icon from a monastery in Mount Sinai. Encaustic, actually super cool. Does anybody know what that process is, what that art style is? It's pigment and wax. So you paint by warming the board up and applying pigments to it, or using spoons or other specialized brushes to apply those things. And it's interesting because you can rework it. You can go back over again by warming it up, right? Kind of like a writing tablet. The other primary form, and this is actually sort of like most of what you see when you start to see icons incorporated into churches, is the form of the mosaic, which I think all of us know. That's little pieces of glass or stone that are applied to the wall with some sort of adhesive. We're not going to get too much into the specifics of it, but one of the neat things about mosaic is it lets you control how light plays over each individual piece. So for example, if you ever look at this icon, which is from Hagia Sophia, it's from the narthex, if you look up really close, you'll see that the orientation in the halos is actually different than the orientation in the field, so that as you move through the space, the light reflects differently and actually sort of draws your eye to the face as opposed to the field. So you still get variation even within one color. It's really cool stuff. And then the one that you actually see most commonly these days in churches is fresco or mural, because technically speaking, those are different practices, right? But realistically, they come out to the same. That adorn the walls of the church. Panel icons are sometimes used for that, but most often they're used in very specific moments in the church, and the rest of it is either mosaic or fresco or undecorated. So let's talk a little bit about those things that we just discussed, where they actually come from, because their history is really fascinating. So as a technique, that practice is actually rooted in a couple different things. One of them being the sort of the funeral practices of the ancient Near East. Think a mummy sarcophagus, right? It's actually kind of an analogous idea. And then also things that are contained within the Hebrew scriptures. I think if you were like me, maybe raised in a very conservative Protestant context, you were raised with the idea that all Jews are monotheists who completely reject images. I mean, one of those things is true. But if you look historically, which we'll go into a little bit, you find that actually it's fairly common for Jewish communities to use images that are similar to Christian icons in their worship spaces, in particular in synagogues. So on the left here is one of the earliest examples that we have of panel painting, period. We know that it exists because we have written records of it, but one of the things about panels in the ancient world is you can only make them from wood, and wood tends to rot when it sits for a long time. But in this particular city in Egypt, it's called Fayum. It was a place where there was a lot of artistic production, and in fact, this illustration here, which we'll talk about in a second, probably actually came from Fayum originally. It was prepared there and then finished elsewhere in the Roman Empire. But this is just an example of one of thousands of instances that we found of what are called funerary portraits. They're little wooden panels that have been prepared using encaustic to be a portrait of somebody who died. Sometimes they would be kept as something on their own, but most often what you see is they're actually included in a mummified body or an embalmed body over the face. So when I was talking about a pharaonic burial mask, right? If you aren't a pharaoh and super rich, well, this is what you can do. And this was fairly common. It wasn't just rich people who were doing this. One of the interesting things is that they found unfinished examples of these, and basically what they do is they would prepare a series of generic faces, and then because encaustic allows you to rework it, they would redo the portrait to reflect certain specific features of the person that was used, so they can mass produce them. But at the same time, they can be adjusted to the individual. And I think that that's interesting because I think it says a lot about what makes us who we are. That there's a lot that's in common among human persons, but there are little things that really let us know, oh, I know my husband because I remember what his eyes look like. And so the artist goes in and adjusts the eyes. Or remember he had just such a cut of a beard, and adjusts that thing. I don't know, I just think it's incredibly cool. And then we have some other examples, not only in funerary practices, but in general art. So this is an illustration called the Severin Tondo. A tondo is just a fancy word for a round painting. It's a portrait of Septimius Severus, his wife, and his two children. You can tell one of them fell out of favor because the face has been intentionally removed. This is actually some fascinating stuff you can look up in Roman history. But I want to point that out because it's something that exists outside of the secular culture, or outside of the religious culture, right? You have something that you use in burial, and then something that you do to commemorate your emperor and his children, and then one of them not so much anymore, right? Those practices, the idea of depicting the image of somebody who has died for their remembrance, of painting portraits of famous individuals, gets brought into and incorporated into the life of the church as it emerges out of Judaism. Because remember, the people in Judea are doing these same things. They're creating these portraits, they're illustrating their synagogues if they're wealthy enough to own a synagogue, which not all of them were. And so you see that brought into Christian practice. In particular, actually, the earliest examples are the catacombs in Rome, which we'll touch on in a bit. But I wanted to include this example because it's an encaustic portrait that draws on a lot of the styles that you see present here. Right? You have sort of a regal depiction of a man with a beard. You have, at the same time, a funerary portrait with sort of generic clothes. In this particular instance, it's a portrait of the Apostle Peter. For those of you who are Christians, you know he's sort of a big deal. Moving on from there, there's also, you begin to see in the early 3rd century, and I'm saying that not to exclude the possibility of them existing earlier, but these are just the earliest ones that we found because, again, fresco tends to degrade pretty quickly when a building collapses. But I think a really fascinating one to point out here is the city of Dura Europos. Again, if you're a complete nerd like me, you should definitely go check this out because it's really cool. It's a city in, I think, modern-day Syria on the Euphrates River. It existed because there was a stopover port there on the river. And the city is like 50% houses and 50% temples. And all of those temples are frescoed like this. But there's also a synagogue and a house that was converted into a Christian church. And those buildings also have that same kind of illustration. So it's significant for our talk because you begin to see how images can be incorporated into architecture in a way that highlights the importance of a particular place. Anybody who's ever been to a synagogue service, you know that there's a section in the church called a bema, and there's an element on there called an ark, and that ark contains the Torah scroll, and a lot of the liturgy of modern day Judaism sort of revolves around that liturgical space. Well, that's exactly what that is. So that already exists in the third century of an illustrated space that uses images to draw the attention of the worshipers to certain ideas. All of these scenes in here, they're not arbitrary. They're scenes from the Torah, which is sort of the formative moment for Jewish people. So, kind of parallel to that, in Rome, in the catacomb of Priscilla, and in Dura Europos itself, you also have Christian wall art beginning to flourish in the form of a fresco. The fascinating thing actually about the catacomb of Priscilla is if you sort of map how the frescoes are incorporated into the space, it's very similar to what we're going to discuss when we talk about liturgical space in Christian churches. That you have a moment here that most likely was used as an altar. The idea being not only can you go hide in a catacomb because nobody's down there, but also a martyr might have been buried there. You begin to see depictions of the Last Supper over that space. You have a depiction of the Magi coming to visit Mary and the child Jesus. And then in certain other areas, we even have depictions of, like, for example, Christ as the Good Shepherd in paradise surrounded by peacocks, of men and women praying together. It's really cool stuff. And similarly, in Dura Europos, they had a completely illuminated baptismal space that uses, so if you think about the synagogue using imagery from the Torah, the baptismal space uses imagery from Christian scripture to sort of bring the mind of the people who are there to what's actually happening to the person who's being baptized. So then, let's flash forward a little bit more to Constantine coming to power and legalizing Christianity in the Roman Empire. It's a little more complicated than that, but we're not going to get into the weeds. Legalizing Christianity in the Roman Empire, it's no longer illegal, so it starts to flourish in terms of architectural and liturgical art, right? You begin to actually be able to have purpose-built churches instead of just, knocking down a wall in your house in order to make a space where you're not going to be killed. And it results in this explosion of, in particular, mosaic, but also fresco art, both in the West. For example, these are both from similar churches in Ravenna. This is from San Apollinare Nuovo. This is from a nearby Arian church where you have a baptistry that's completely illuminated on its dome with frescoes, or a church that's covered in all of its side walls with mosaic. And then likewise in the East at Hagia Sophia of Constantinople and of Thessaloniki, and the monastery of Saint Luke, which is in Greece. This is quite a bit late. Oh, it would have been nice if I included the dates here. Yeah, Hagia Sophia in Constantinople is 6th century, as we all know. I think that Hagia Sophia of Thessaloniki is a couple hundred years later, if I'm not mistaken. And then the St. Luke Monastery is from the 900s. And in here you actually have instances of both mosaic and of fresco, and of panel icons all being used together to shape liturgical space. But you can see that it's completely integrated into the architecture. It's not something that's applied on top. And I think that's the important thing to sort of like understand about how this actually works, is that it's not decoration. It's part of the design of the church. It's a holistic thing that invites the person in the space into the experience of that space. This is why I think it's interesting for us to think about as architects and interior designers, is because we may not be designing religious spaces, but that idea of a space that's holistic is something that we can keep in mind whenever we're creating, creating architecture and spaces for our clients. So before I go on to how they're actually used in space, does anybody have any questions so far? Anything that you've seen that's intriguing, or sort of like, oh, I don't know about that? Anything at all? No?
Have you been to all the places that you've been like showing?
Okay. Have I been?
No, yeah, have you been?
No.
Yeah.
It's much to my embarrassment. I've actually never traveled outside of the U.S. Part of that, it's mostly because I keep forgetting to actually file to get a passport. Part of it is I joke with Stephanie that if we've got all of these spaces, these places in the U.S. that people will come from other countries to come see, like our national parks, of which there are, hundreds. Why would I spend money to go to another country when I could see these natural, beautiful wonders here without having to get a passport? That's mostly just me being belligerent and giving her a hard time, because she likes to travel and I would like to. I keep forgetting to file for my passport. I have been to a lot of Orthodox churches in the United States, but not overseas, unfortunately. So I think, any other questions before I move on? Okay, so we're going to talk now about how these are actually incorporated into the space. This is the part where I said if you've taken architectural history, you're going to roll your eyes, right? So I think most of us remember, I know. I think most of us remember, if we studied this in school, that there are sort of like two basic plans of churches that you see. There's the basilica, which is modeled on a type of Roman civil architecture. Basilicas were typically used for halls where civil judgments were handed out. That correlation is intentional. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And then the other type that you come in, that's more Western, really. Although, we tend to talk about the Western and Eastern Roman Empire, but frankly, up until about 1300, there was tons of cross-commerce all along the Mediterranean. And in fact, you still had Byzantine artists decorating the interiors of Roman Catholic churches after the schism between the churches. Let's keep working on it. God, I can't stand that thing. The other type you see commonly in the East is I was taught it as cross and dome, but cross and square I'm finding is actually more common how it's referred to, like in scholarly writing. But it's not dissimilar, because it does have a nave and an aisle, but it tends to be a series of smaller vaults joined with a central dome. And vertically, they look quite different than a basilica. And the other thing that differentiates them is that cross and dome tends to have continuous columns all the way to the floor that are very large and heavy, whereas basilicas tend to have much wider spaced columns that run along the central nave and an uninterrupted vertical space up here, but the construction tends to be more like a typical roof. We're going to talk about 4 different zones in a church. Namely the narthex, the nave and the dome, which we'll discuss together, and then the bema and the apse, which we'll discuss together as well. Each of these spaces has a definite function in a church. They have architectural precedence, right? Because all of this stuff comes out of civil architecture. But they have different meanings, and each of those meanings corresponds to the iconographic program that's used in that space. So the first space we'll talk about is the narthex. That word comes from a Greek word that it means porch, but it acquired in the Greek language a connotation of sort of like cleansing or purgation. And the reason for that is it's intentionally, as a porch, a liminal space, a place where you cross a threshold. So it's before you enter the main body of the church. It tends to be decorated, if it is in fact decorated with images at all, with Old Testament symbols. The reason being, with the overall program of, you're moving through the church, you're progressing closer to the presence of God on earth. This is where it starts. So that's where you start. You begin in the Old Testament, or you begin like you see in Hagia Sophia, and this is actually much more common in Eastern churches prior to the iconoclast controversy, which happens in about the 8th, 9th century. You see just exquisite figural work that has no definite image, right? And the point of this space is for you to prepare yourself to transition from the world into the actual worship space itself. It also acquires that connotation of purgation because in the early days of the church, if you wanted to learn about the church and become a member, that's where you had to spend your time. You were educated there. You would be there for part of the you would be inside the church for part of the service and then be asked to leave. And then also, if you were doing public penance, this is where you went, and that's where it acquires that connotation of cleansing. The next part is the nave. This is also sometimes in English called the sanctuary, and then in scholarly language it's called the naos, which is a Greek word that means the inner part of a temple. And that relationship is very significant because in the Christian idea, the nave represents the kingdom of heaven. That's the place where you want to be if you're a Christian, right? But the added significance of the term naos, which is how it's spoken about even historically, is that was a place that in pagan worship and in the religion of Judaism as well, that sanctuary was only reserved for certain people. Basically, if you were a priest, you went into the naos, right? And the significance for Christians is that everybody's brought into there. I can go into that a little bit separately if you want to. It's not super relevant to the topic right now, but the idea is that everybody is now in the place that formerly was reserved for only a few. So, generally speaking, even if the church is actually square in its plan, the iconography has a definite orientation, right? And it's toward the altar, which historically speaking is placed in the east. That's because in most ancient religions, the east is associated with sort of renewal because that's where the sun comes from, right? It's the beginning of a new day. It's the sign of everybody sort of like waking up and everything starting. And in fact, in some of the most ancient churches, and unfortunately I don't have images of them because I guess nobody decided that they wanted to photograph this, it's pretty common in the apse to include an opening that admits the light of the dawn into the church so that you can see it coming in from the altar. And that's obviously, as churches develop, or as architecture develops and you can have more and more glass, that transitions to stained glass windows, right? Or like, really rose windows are in the west facade, but like incorporating large amounts of glass to bring in light, but then intentionally filter it, right? And so what you tend to see in the decoration of the nave is depictions of saints or depictions of events in the life of the church, which you see in the Montreal Cathedral. It's the life of Christ depicted on the spaces between the columns. I forget what the term for this specific element in architecture is. Or I shouldn't say or. This one in particular, San Apollinare Nuovo, is really interesting because it's full of unidentified saints, and they're all men on one side and all women on the other side. Which is interesting, I think, because I find sometimes that there's a connotation of Christianity as something that's very sexist. But if you look at the art in the early church, it actually intentionally integrates women in a way that ancient art often did not. That's something that we don't really talk about a lot, but like Greek culture was like extremely sexist. And so when you compare what you see in this culture, it's a very radical departure from the world outside. The next part of the nave is really the dome. I think we're all sort of familiar with domes being architects, right? And Hagia Sophia in particular being a great example of a massive, unsupported dome. Actually, just want to digress about that for a moment. I remember watching a documentary where they were trying to do restoration work on the cathedral because there were cracks forming in the dome, and they had to reconstruct it, and they couldn't figure out how the original architects actually managed to make the dome as large as it was, unsupported. Essentially, when they try to scale it up beyond a certain point, they can't make it work. Now, I think that maybe has something to do with like the fact that the Romans have this like awesome cement mix that actually gets better the wetter it gets. So as the dome gets rained on, it actually strengthens it. It's fascinating stuff. But typically speaking, the dome, especially in a cross and dome plan church, almost entirely covers the nave. And it's meant to sort of like extend the space vertically. So you'll find in basilicas, you tend to have a general, there's sort of like, it's not a height cap, but it's just like, it's a peaked roof, and they tend to be sort of like, their scale looks different when you're in them, right? Because they have a very definite linear orientation. But as church architecture develops in the East, churches get taller. So you'll find that they'll have these huge vertical walls and then an even larger vaulted dome, and then especially in Russia, you end up with the onion dome, which everybody's familiar with, which interior to the church, that space goes almost all the way up to the dome. So you have these huge vertical spaces that get filled with iconography. The images that you typically see are images that are associated with heaven. So the term, again, if you've taken art history, I apologize if you learned this. This type of icon is called pantokrator. It means the ruler of all. It's like, think about like pan, everything. Kratos is a word in Greek that means to command or to rule. So the dome typically is shown with an icon of Christ at the top, and then it's arranged in a series of tiers that work their way down to the pendentives, and those tiers are typically angels, and then the apostles, or maybe prophets. It depends on how you've decided to do your iconographic program. And the point of that is to represent hierarchy, right? That there's an order in the kingdom, but it's also intentionally meant to connect via the pendentives or the squinches, depending on when the building is built, to connect them, like you see here, down into what's shown in the nave, because it shows the connection between what's happening up in the dome and what the people are doing down at the bottom. And in fact, the idea is that actually all human beings being made in the image of God, in a way, integrate themselves into the architecture when they're participating in the space. This church is just up the street. If you ever want to go see it, let me know. It's up on Massachusetts Avenue by the National Cathedral. So then, as we move a little further into the church, so we've talked about the outer part, we've talked about the central part, the nave, then the next part we're going to talk about is it's a series of architectural elements. The first is called the bema, which is this awesome Greek word that means a step, but it's actually a loan word from Persian that just sort of gets wholesale imported into Greek, and actually is originally only used to talk about a specific altar of Zeus that's like the oldest one that exists in Greece. So the bema is actually, it's kind of hard to see in the photographs, but in most ancient churches, there's a raised platform on which the altar and a low chancel rail or a templon or an iconostasis or whatever is located. And then, architecturally speaking, that's related to the apse, to this interesting little feature, which has a great Greek name called synchronon, which means sitting together if you literally translate it. But it's basically, it's a bishop's chair and a seating for the priests who are serving in the service that day. And then the apse, which I think we all know that word, that's the sort of like half dome and walls that come down and support the back of the church, right? And all of that together architecturally represents the throne of God. And so the iconographic program draws that image out even further. There's typically two images that you see. And now I'll also add a caveat. I'm saying typically, there are always deviations from this, and the deviations are basically always intentional, right? That they're trying to draw out a specific image in their iconographic program. But what you see most commonly in churches is an icon called the Communion of the Apostles, which you can kind of see here. So it recreates the altar that's back behind this wall, and you see that instead of a priest, it's Christ who's giving the bread and the wine to the 12 apostles. And then what's sometimes, so I've usually heard this called the icon of the sign. So if anybody knows the famous prophecy, behold, the virgin will conceive and bear a son, and that's understood to mean Jesus, right? It's an icon of that, which is why you see, we'll talk about this in part 2 about how you actually interpret the images, but what you see is Mary with Jesus inside this circle here. That sort of device means something that can't be seen when you're looking at an icon. So that's meant to be an image of him within her womb. But what you see if you look closely is that he looks like a fully formed adult. That image is of him as sort of like the fullness of a human being already when he comes in her womb. But what you also see is angels on either side. And you'll sometimes see this icon shown with depictions of the like, who knows the biblically accurate angels meme? Has anybody else seen this? Is it just me? Am I the only one who's extremely online? Okay. So basically, if you actually read the scripture and read the depictions of the angels, they're insane looking. It's like a wheel within a wheel, or like hundreds of eyes and wings all about, or like 4 animal faces all looking. It's crazy stuff. So the other variation of this icon is it's Mary with Jesus in her womb, but those images of angels surrounding her. And the significance of that is that in the scripture, it's said that God is enthroned on those beings, that they sort of bear him up. So this image draws together those 2 moments, that he's simultaneously, according to Christian teachings, God and man at once. That's why those things are depicted together. That there's no. That's why all of those things, so to speak, work in the Christian understanding. Okay. But then you also see again we've talked about. I mentioned it briefly. The scene thrown on. This particular church is interesting because it shows you what that is meant to represent. You see the apostles arranged around, I forget what this is called, the drum, I think, I forget what this is called architecturally, but on the wall, they're arranged around here in sort of a position that a Roman secular judge would stand when he was giving judgment, right? And then immediately beneath them, you would see vested priests serving at worship, right? So the significance is to draw together the relationship of the apostles' authority in heaven and the authority of the church on earth, right? So all of those things, again, they incorporate the human person into what's actually happening in the space. And it helps the people who are participating in that worship to keep their attention on what's actually happening before them. And then finally, the last thing that happens in the architectural program is that rear wall, right? Because let's say you walk into a space, right? Like if I come through the front door, I'm usually not looking back behind me unless I hear somebody coming up the steps, right? I mean, the same thing's true when you walk into a church, right? You walk in and your attention is drawn to the eastern part because there's a lot going on. There's the altar, the chancel rail, lots of illustrations, whatever. But at the rear of the nave, you commonly find basically 2 themes. The image of the resurrection, so basically the sort of the ultimate event, or I guess I should say the penultimate event in the Christian life, right? Or of the Last Judgment. Generally speaking, the Last Judgment is more of an Eastern theme for that decoration, and then generally speaking, the resurrection is more common in the West. But again, that's not a solid rule, and in fact, in this church, you have them both arranged together. And that's also intentional, because it draws together the fact that, well, he rose from the dead, and then Christian theology says, well, he's coming again, so be prepared, otherwise this is what awaits you. And again, we can talk about the specific interpretation of how to break down what this image actually means, because it's a lot of weird stuff, especially if you're not used to looking at like Eastern art. But the point of that is to serve either as a reminder of the hope that all Christians have, it's an image of the resurrection, or of a reminder of what's going to come at the end, so that as you're leaving the church, you always have in mind what you did, because this is where it ultimately leads to. I mean, yeah, it's a little threatening, but actually if you read the gospel pretty closely, it's kind of threatening too. Yeah, so that's actually kind of it. I don't really have a lot more to share. I think part 2 is maybe going to be a little more practical and interesting, because then I'll actually have a chance to talk about what I do, because I paint icons, but only panel icons, because I'm not good enough to paint a fresco. That's kind of it. I don't know if anybody has any questions or sort of stuff that maybe you didn't understand or you want to know more about. I don't know, if anybody who knows me pretty well knows I can discourse for hours on inane things. So yeah, that's kind of it. So thanks. I hope that didn't take too long.
No, that was great, James.
So, out of all those icons that you were kind of showing us, which one is kind of the one that interests you the most? Is there a story or one that you really like a lot?
That's a good question. In a sense, this middle one here, because I basically painted that as a panel icon for that church up on Cathedral or up on Mass Ave. So I spent a lot of time with it, and it's a very interesting image. But that's a really good question. If I had to say that I was like, there's one that I'm like, yeah, I'm totally into this. It's probably like the catacomb Dura Europa stuff, just because it's, I don't know. Again, I was raised being taught that like a Jewish person would never participate in this, right? Putting images in front of them, and actually as I'm growing up a little bit, I mean I've known about the Dura Europa synagogue for years, but I'm realizing that's actually basically the opposite of what's true. That like there's like tons of these synagogues all throughout Galilee that have these beautiful mosaics or frescoes or whatever. And then they even incorporate things like the zodiac, right? And it's just so cool. And when you start to delve into the individual images, for me, it's fascinating to be able to look at something like this and be like, oh yeah, like visually that functions in the same way that this does, right? It's cool to see those parallels, especially as somebody who, is involved in this every day, right? Or I guess, Sunday, but obviously also every day. That it's cool to see the thread that connects back through human history down to this present day. And I mean, even if you look at some of the stuff that I've included here, I mean, they're like contemporary iconography, right? Like these were actually done by the same artist. This is 2009, 2017, right? It's a living tradition. And that, I think, is the coolest thing about it to me. That it's a living tradition that people are still involved in, but it all goes back, to this, right? That's why I think it's fascinating. And also, I like archaeology, so I guess that makes me a nerd. But it's cool to me to learn about how people are discovering this stuff and preserving it. And I mean, the preservation is really important too, because this was destroyed in 2012 by ISIS when they took over this part of Syria. They actually completely obliterated the town because it had these kinds of images in it, right? Now, fortunately, the frescoes in Dura Europos, both in the church and in the synagogue, and I think in some of the pagan temples as well. So because of the way fresco is done, you can sever it from the wall and keep it intact. You can basically get behind it and separate the bonding agent from the underlying structure and detach it. So they've preserved the art, but the buildings are gone. I mean, they've been leveled. They're rubble now. So it's important that we pay attention to this stuff, right? Because it can just literally go away. I mean, even when we found it, it was basically you have this back wall, but I'm actually pretty sure that this photograph is a reconstruction. I don't think it was found in this state. I'm pretty sure the back wall was rubble and the roof had fallen in, and they just basically found all the elements and reconstructed them in a museum. But if you look at photographs at the excavation site, I mean, it was junk, right? I mean, the walls are completely destroyed. It actually happened that this one was built into the wall of the city, which is why it wasn't completely level, because the walls tend to be a lot stronger than everything else. Yeah, again, see, look, here I am going on about a name things forever. I love this stuff. It's fascinating. Yeah. So yeah, I would say the early frescoes are it's great stuff, and it's very expressive too. If you ever look at some of, especially the stuff in the Catacomb of Priscilla, this image of nobody actually knows who the woman is there. I assume it's the Priscilla after whom the catacomb is named. But if you look at these images, when you look at them up close, I mean, they're tiny and they're gorgeously executed, and they were executed by people who were hiding for their lives, right? There's a certain pathos to it that's just really palpable when you see them, right? And I hope one day to actually go see them in person, right? Because I'm only ever seeing them as images on a screen, essentially, right, or in a book, right? Yeah. Anybody else? Questions? No? All right, well, thanks everybody. I guess we'll all enjoy our beer.
Very knowledgeable.
Setting the bar so high.
Awesome. How do I exit out of this?